Someone like me who's been homeless, addicted to drugs, who's been incarcerated, person who's been at the bottom of the barrel, we don't scare easy. We done been through hell and back. And so these bully tactics that some of these politicians are trying to implement, why they might scare some people, they don't scare us, right? And so we're fighting back, and we're fighting back by being more assertive, more aggressive, in engaging with folks. And we believe that, in all honesty, that we are the best people to do that, because it takes someone who has lost the right to vote, right? Who finally understands how valuable the right to vote is and how we honor that by actually going out to vote. It takes someone like that, right, to engage in conversations, even with other people who have never lost the right to vote, but have never exercised it.
Welcome to People in Common. I'm Jema. The world's problems right now are big and overwhelming, and we feel farther apart than ever, but we aren't sure what to do. This is a series of conversations with incredible people offering inspiration and practical guidance about how to save our planet and the people on it. We lift up the stories from the front lines to help us meet this moment. We are People in Common. So glad you joined us. Desmond Meade is one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He convinced nearly 65% of Florida voters to amend their constitution, restoring voting rights to 1.4 million people with previous felony convictions. Stacey Abrams said it was, quote, the largest expansion of voting rights in a half century, and Desmond made it happen. Desmond Meade, can you please introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Desmond Meade. I am the executive director of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. It's an organization, a grassroots organization in Florida that's comprised of people with previous felony convictions, as well as people who have loved ones who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. We're a statewide organization boasting over 17,000 members and in over 20 chapters throughout the state. And my organization was the lead in the effort, campaign effort to restore voting rights to 1.4 million returning citizens in Florida. It was the largest expansion of voting rights in over 50 years. And we were able to really deal, I would say, a death blow to 150-year-old Jim Crow policy that's been in place in Florida, which permanently disenfranchised people with felony convictions. We were victorious in that in 2018. And since then, we have been tirelessly working to ensure that every one of the 1.4 million realize the benefit of the passage of Amendment 4. In the process of doing that, we are engaging in different tactics and campaigns in such a way as to create an excitement around voting, around participating in democracy, and getting people who have historically been marginalized, historically been silenced, and helping them to realize the power that they possess through the franchise.
Wow. I mean, and you have, to be clear, you personally and your entire team of staff and volunteers and everybody is out there literally telling people that they have been granted their right to vote and making sure that they can actually do that. Can you talk about the Free the Vote bus tour, which I know is going on right now?
Yeah, that Free the Vote bus tour, I'm telling you, it's something special. And one of the things that, I like about it is that it symbolizes our response to the avalanche of voter suppression legislation that you're seeing being introduced and implemented throughout this country, right? Even here in the state of Florida. And so what that bus symbolizes is that we respond to suppression with aggression. If you're going to try to suppress the right to vote, we're going to be more aggressive in talking to people about why is it important to participate in our democracy. we're going to be more aggressive in making sure that people are eligible to vote. And then those who are eligible to register to vote, we're going to be more aggressive in getting them registered to vote. Because we believe, like, these laws are designed to pick people, voters off on the fringes, right? And so if they're going to implement a law that's going to stop 10 people from voting, that means that we're going to get 100 people, 100 new voters to engage in our democracy. If they want to implement a policy that would make it more difficult for 200 people to vote, then we're going out there and getting 2,000 people to participate in our democracy. And so that free to vote bus tour symbolizes that attitude, right? That we would not be coward. One of the things about returning citizens, and I'll get into my story a little bit later, but someone like me who's been homeless, addicted to drugs, who's been incarcerated, person who's been at the bottom of the barrel, we don't scare easy. We done been through hell and back. And so these bully tactics that some of these politicians are trying to implement, why they might scare some people, they don't scare us, right? And so we're fighting back, and we're fighting back by being more assertive, more aggressive in engaging with folks. And we believe that, in all honesty, that we are the best people to do that, because it takes someone who has lost the right to vote, right? Who finally understands how valuable the right to vote is and how we honor that by actually going out to vote. It takes someone like that, right, to engage in conversations, even with other people who have never lost the right to vote, but have never exercised it. Right. And so we're going to be that emissary, and we're going to go out there, and we're going to talk to everybody we can talk to. Our primary focus are returning citizens, but they have loved ones and family members who have never lost the right to vote and may have never cast a ballot in their life. And we're making sure that they understand the importance of them doing so.
Absolutely. A universally shared opinion is that we don't know how to talk to each other anymore. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? And I think you are someone who is able to talk to anyone, and you have bets with your staff. If you have 5 minutes with someone, they will walk away as a voter for the Voting Rights Amendment, Amendment 4 in Florida. So tell me, how do we talk to each other?
Wow, you're talking like as if you read my book, Let My People Vote.
Of course, everybody check this out. Yeah, if you haven't read it yet, Let My People Vote.
Yeah, because in that book I talk about that and how, even thinking now, when you said it's so hard for us to talk to each other, I think one of the reasons why is that what we see before we see a human being is a label. We see a white person, we see a possible conservative, we see someone that may be an immigrant or whatever. We see all these different labels before we see the humanity in people. Right? It's easy for us to talk to each other. Let me tell you, we always demonstrate that in various times, like particularly after hurricanes, right? After hurricanes, it's not, you see how people come together, right? To help each other out, to help the neighbor out, to help a community out, right? And people are talking to each other, they're working together, they're helping each other out, and they're not overly concerned about what your politics is or your nationality or the color of your skin or whatever. And so we've seen that, and so I know that we can do it. It's just that we allow ourselves to be drugged back into this realm of the puppet master, right? That tells us that we need to hate people because they're such and such, and we have all these labels, on either side, To be honest with you, I don't even know what those labels mean. When I look at you and I look at someone, the first thing I see is a human being. And I think that that's what we address, and when we see a human being, we can connect along the lines of humanity and we can have that conversation. And that's what I did during the Amendment 4 campaign. I purposely went and sought out people who the establishment said would not agree with me. People who the establishment said would be against the restoration of voting rights to people with felony convictions. I purposely sought those individuals out. And let me tell you, I've had beautiful conversations, right? And I've met people who are really cool. They just have a difference of opinion on some things with me, but for the most part, we agree on the same thing. We have the same fears. We have the same desires. And so I think that when I did that, I didn't realize what I was getting into, but it evolved into something that was like, wow, wait a minute. We don't have to be as divided as we are as a country. Because I even think of, and when I was talking to those folks, you know what I thought about was football. When you see those images of the houses that are split in half with Alabama colors on one side, Auburn or Michigan and Ohio State, you know, when you see those things, right? And how you could have a family like in Florida, it's probably Florida versus Florida State, and they could be on opposite ends of the spectrum, but they still remain a family. They still love each other. And it had me thinking, I'm like, wait a minute. What family don't have disagreements? What family don't have arguments and fights or whatever, you know? But there is something there in the family that allows them to remain a family. And so I think that that is the same thing in our country, in our society, in our communities. That we can have differences of opinion and still operate as a community, still operate as a country, and engaging in amendment for really solidified that belief for me.
Hmm. What is it that binds us as an American family?
Well, let me tell you, there's a lot of things, right? And most of the things that binds us as an American family are the things that binds us as a human race, right? The difference or the little section that's maybe different from everything else is our allegiance and our love of our country, all right? And our desire to be a part of a system, right, in which we really have a say in how we're being governed. That's all part of that process anyhow, because one thing I learned in law school is that theoretically a human being have all their rights, right? And they have the supreme power, right? But we give up those rights, some of those rights, in order to live amongst each other, right? And we want to live amongst each other because together we can prosper. Together, it provides security and safety. And so we relinquish some of those rights to a collective body that we choose and we direct. And so I think that that basic concept is something that connects us all as Americans. That, wait a minute, we are in a country where we don't have a dictator, that we're not under the foot of some madman, and because we sort of came real close to that. But we're in a country where there is some form of democracy there, and there's some form of or presence of people actually deciding, what happens in their community. That people actually have a role and a word in determining our future and the future for our kids and our grandkids, right? And what the most powerful way that happens is also the most telling symbol of citizenship, and that's the vote. Nothing speaks more to citizenship than being able to vote, right? And it is our vote that determines what happens in the future for our kids and our grandkids. It's our vote that determines how our society is governed and who governs it. And so voting is, I think, something that can that yeah, it brings us together because we're talking about participating in a shared dream of democracy, and their various opinions here and there, or approaches or perspectives. But at its core are three famous words. And you know what they are? We the people.
Yes. And I love how you talk about how fundamental and sacred the right to vote is. That at its core, voting says, I am. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. This past August, 2020, I voted for the first time in over 30 years. And let me tell you, and when I voted in November in the general election, that was my first ever presidential election I voted in. And I'm over 50 years old, right? And that was the first time I ever got to vote for the president of the United States. But that moment, that special moment occurred during the primary. And I remember when I was walking up to my precinct and I started thinking about all the blood that was shed for our freedoms and for this democracy. And I thought about my ancestors who were hung on trees, who was burned, who was beaten, bitten by dogs, and having all kinds of atrocities done to them to keep them from registering to vote and to keep them from voting. And knowing that my ancestors, in the face of all of this adversity, still went to register to vote, knowing that by doing so they might be murdered, right? They still pressed through. Not only did they do it to register to vote, but they did it again just to go and vote. So they had to do it twice. And then I thought about the so many volunteers who had volunteered for Amendment 4, and they sacrificed a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to number one, get Amendment 4 on the ballot, number two, get it passed, right? And all of those people making all of those sacrifices. And, I just felt like I was walking on hallowed ground. That the ground that that precinct was on was sacred because of the blood that was shed on the soil for me, for people like me to be able to vote. And so when I walked in there and I got my ballot, and when I went to the voting booth, I was realizing that, man, I'm getting ready to engage in a sacred act, right? Because I'm walking on hollow ground. There's a level of sacredness that's attached to voting because of the sacrifices that was made and the lives that were lost for that. And so I know that me voting, I was actually committing a sacred act. And then while I was doing it, it dawned on me that what I was engaged in transcended partisan politics, and it transcended even racial biases and all of that, and it really that act that I was engaged in actually took me to that place that said, "I am." It spoke to my existence as a human being and the significance of the role that I play within my community or within my society, right? That when I was voting, I wasn't voting as a Democrat, I wasn't voting as a Republican, man, I was voting as a human being, right? And it spoke to the humanity piece of it. And so it was a very special moment for me to be able to engage in that. Part of me was angry because the puppet masters or these politicians have taken something as sacred as voting, right? And has politicized it to a point where, it's like you have politicians now that are deciding who get to vote and who don't get to vote, and when they get to vote and how they can vote and making it even difficult for people to vote. And at the end of the day, they're the last persons that should be engaged in that. When they're trying to silence our voice, right? I think what they're doing also at the same time is diminishing our humanity. And they're saying that you're not worthy of having your voice heard. You're not worthy of having a deciding voice in the direction of this country. You're not worthy of that. You need to let other people do it for you because you're not good enough. Like what we're seeing happening is more than just a racial thing. I think it's a direct assault against democracy. I think it impacts everybody, right? Whether you black, white, conservative, progressive, it impacts everybody because it impacts our democracy.
some of the most powerful and just blatant examples of what you're describing, I've watched some of the clemency hearings, the clemency board in Florida, especially, I mean, Rick Scott looking people in the eye and saying essentially, yes, I commend you on yes, you are absolutely qualified to vote. I commend you on turning your life around. And I'm going to go ahead and deny your bid to become a voter for no reason. And we can point to so many examples, but what does that do? What does that do to people and our democracy as a whole?
I tell you what it tells me, that no politician, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or whatever, should have that much power to decide, especially, when that decision making process is arbitrary. That was painful to watch. It became infuriating when, maybe later on during the hearing, you have someone that says, "Hey, if I could vote, I could vote for you." They said, "Granted, you get your rights back," right? And we've seen that. And I think that one particular instance you're talking about, that woman actually worked for the state. She was a state employee. And to tell someone who made a mistake, it's crazy. Let me tell you, it's crazy. It flies in the face of everything, right? We know that a politician of all people sitting in judgment of someone else and determining whether or not they're good enough to vote, that is something that was just not right with that. And so looking at those hearings was both painful and infuriating all at the same time. But it served as a catalyst for us to know that, listen, we have to get the people together and let the people take the power, that kind of power, out of the hands of politicians. And that what Amendment 4 did. And no matter what piece of legislation comes after that, the one thing that we can say is that we have secured within the Constitution of the state of Florida a pathway for people to be able to vote and participate in our democracy without having to grovel at the knees of any politician.
That's a pretty powerful image. And if you watch those hearings, that's what's happening. I mean, it is physically true. For those reasons you just described, you have been very honest about not wanting politicians to, say, endorse Amendment 4 for sure. And you have said no. You have stood up and said no to some of just the ways that politics works, even though you are in the middle of politics. Tell me, how does that feel?
That is a tightrope there. I often say that, I believe that voting is not as political as we make it, right? Even though there is all of the tendencies would lead one to say, okay, no, that's a political act. I think that is something deeper than than politics. It's always a tightrope because we talk about when we dealing with voting rights. Folks always want to put your efforts as a progressive effort or as a conservative effort. Either want to label you Democrat or Republican. I think that it's something deeper than that, and I think that when we politicize voting, we actually diminish ourselves. One of the experiences is that, like after Amendment 4 passed and you had folks that was very anxious to register returning citizens, right? And you could tell that the reason that they wanted to do so was because they wanted to gain more voters for their party. The problem with that is that when you're approaching folks that way, or when you're approaching an activity that way, you're basically saying that I am nothing but a pawn in your political gamesmanship, which means that you're less concerned about who I am as a human being and more concerned about who I am as a voter, right? And the thing is that my humanity should trump, what I'm saying, me being a voter. And I think that that could be one of the reasons why we do have a level of apathy throughout the country and in our communities, because people don't see themselves as part of the process, but more of as a pawn in the game. And not everybody wants to play that game. that I have to be against you or someone else, and if I don't agree with you, then I'm not a good person, and, no, it's since when has it been that way? I have a beautiful wife that I love so much, and I know that she loves me dearly, but we don't agree on everything. We definitely don't agree on everything. I don't think that just because somebody does not have the same political view that we have, that we should demonize them, that we should ostracize them. I don't think we should engage in that. But what happens is that this voting thing has become a tool to do so, right? So how many Republicans can we register? How many Dems can we register? And you want to get more Dems to come out or more Republicans to come out, when the reality is what we want is just more people coming out. Because the more people participate in our democracy, the more vibrant it is. And if my engagement around restoring voting rights is based solely upon how I think someone may vote, if I'm only fighting for you because I think that you're gonna pick my side on something, then I'm not really fighting for you. I'm fighting for me. I'm not fighting for you. And I'm definitely not fighting for us. Because when I'm fighting for us, then that means regardless of whether or not you may agree with me, regardless of whether or not you may vote the way that I would love for you to vote, I need you to participate in the process. And if we truly believe in a democracy, then you know what? Even though we may believe something, if everybody comes to vote and at the end of the day, more people vote for the other thing, then you should be okay with that and keep it moving. But it's when the game is rigged, it's when tactics are in place that minimizes the people that would vote for something or minimize the ability of people being able to vote for something. That's when we have to fight. But it's still not left versus right. It's not fighting for the left to have an advantage. It's not fighting for the left to be fair. It's fighting for the entire system to operate the way it should be. And that means that not only do I want to rally the people that's on the left, I need to rally the people on the right as well.
I think there's a lot of people hungering for exactly what you're talking about, especially people who do not already see themselves. They're not in the game. They don't want to, they're not pawn, they are nothing. They're completely outside of the system. And I think especially important in this is you are fighting for our democracy. And I think we both recognize that the system is flawed. Our democracy is in peril, and it hasn't been perfect. I mean, it far from it. Tell us, how have you gone out and actionalized that?
Having conversations. One of the stories is during the campaign for Amendment 4, we went into this conservative county, and there was a gentleman who had a home at the corner right across the street from precinct. And he had Republican signs littering his lawn. He didn't have a sidewalk, but he had a grassy area on the outside of his fence right next to the street. And all you see was campaign signs for conservative candidates. I remember telling my son, I'm going to get an Amendment 4 sign on his property. He was like, there's no way that's happening. And as we were walking up, this guy, he came out of his house and he made this pastor leave, right? He was like, you need to get away from my property. And the reason why he made the pastor leave, because the pastor had a football jersey on and it had the number 7 on it for Colin Kaepernick, right? Mind you, it wasn't the San Francisco 49er jersey. It was just a regular jersey, but that 7 was associated with Colin Kaepernick. And so this guy kicked the pastor off his property. As we were walking up, we're watching this, and my son was like, "You definitely not getting an amendment for." Yeah, I was like, "Just watch." And I approached this guy, and I was like, "Oh, why did you kick that guy off?" He said, "Oh, he's one of those Kaepernick people, anti-police and unpatriotic and all of that." And then he started talking about socialists and how the a progressive candidate was nothing but a socialist, and started just talking about what socialist means and all that. And he was actually railing about, listen now, about government dominating people's lives and having no accountability and doing anything they want to civilians and getting away with it. And after he railed for a while, I said, you know what? I said, guess what, bro? You're like, what? I said, that's what Colin was kneeling for. He was kneeling for you, buddy. And when I told him that, his eyes glazed over. He didn't know how to handle that, right? That this guy that he was taught because of labels to despise without even really knowing what Colin Kaepernick was doing, when he was finally told that what he was despising this guy for was exactly what he want people to guard against, he couldn't handle it. And then he was like blown away. And we continued talking, and as it turned out, his mom and his sister were returning citizens. And so by the end of our conversation, not only did I get an Amendment 4 sign in his property, I got about 5 signs put in prime locations on his property. Corner lot, 5 signs. And when I walked away, the pastor was like, you think you're doing something? What? He's going to pull them up as soon as you leave. And I said, okay, pastor, come by here tomorrow and let me know if they're still there. And he did. And he called and said, they're still there. And so the thing that exchange told me that, first of all, we are so taught. I mean, even during the campaign, it was like, no, you have to mobilize your base and you have to neutralize the opposition and try to move the middle, right? And I was like, no, no, we're not only going to mobilize our base, right? Because in reality, our base is all over. Because we have people who have lost the right to vote that are conservative leaning as well as progressive leaning, and some that don't care either way. And so, no, we're going into these communities. That's what I did. Having these conversations taught me that we were conditioned to believe that it's a waste of time to speak to certain type of people. As a matter of fact, let me go a little deeper. We are conditioned to believe that it's a waste of time to even talk to our own people, right? How many campaigns you've seen that have walk lists and have you knock on one door and walk past 20 other doors, right? And then get mad when people don't show up, right? We've been conditioned not even talk to our own people, but more so to not talk to people who we have labeled as our enemies. I think we've actually managed to create a society in which our neighbors are our enemies or our even family members are our enemies because whether or not they believe in abortion or whether or not they believe in trickle down economics or whether or not they believe in policing practices, all of a sudden now they are our enemy. And what I've learned in recovery, in Alcoholic Anonymous tells you, you don't hate the person, you hate the disease, right? And so what I've learned is that no, I'm not hating that person and thinking that that person is my enemy. I might hate a system that has a person thinking that way because that same system had this man hating a number, hating a number because what it represented, right? And not even realizing that what it really represented was the things that he cared about. But he would never know that. He would never know that because he is not in proximity to someone that could talk to him about that because no one wants to talk to him about that that's on the other side. And so there's this wall there, and his hatred and his anger and his resentment continues to grow every single day. And our frustrations and our anger and our resentment continues to grow every day, and eventually it blows up. And it shows its face like in the insurrection at the Capitol. It shows its face in some of the protests. It shows its face in a very violent way. And people are yelling at each other and screaming at each other, but no one's talking to each other. And these labels prevent us from doing that. And so with the campaign, we got rid of labels. We didn't see labels. Every person was a potential supporter of Amendment 4. And that's why we had about 65% people voted for Amendment 4. We had at least 1 million people who voted for Amendment 4 were Republicans, right? At least 1 million. And what I like to tell people is that we got people to vote for Amendment 4, not based on hate or fear, but rather on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And we showed the world that love can, in fact, win the day, that we don't have to tear each other down. We don't have to be fearful of each other in order to move major policies. And we can do that. We've done amazing things as a country when we've been able to transcend the partisan politics. We come together and we bounce back from tragedy when we throw the politics out the door, when we throw the biases out the door, and we just come together as human beings. We've done amazing things. Even during this pandemic, we've seen the beautiful times have been when people have come together along the lines of humanity. The ugly times have been when politicians have been involved and it's been political.
Last time we were together, you talked about winning with love. Tell us how you did that.
I was so tempted to say, folks ought to grab a copy and let my people vote. Right? It's in there. I would love to say that it was this brilliant idea that I thought about, from the very beginning, but I know that that's not true. I know that it was something that I basically stumbled on, because just a frustration. In 2011, we had a new administration take office, Rick Scott administration, and one of the very first things he and his cabinet did was to undo the previous policies around clemency and made it even more difficult. Just to give an example, when Jeb Bush was the governor for 4 years, over 75,000 people were able to have their civil rights restored, which include voting rights. Right after him, we had Governor Charlie Crist. And in his 4 years, over 155,000 people were able to have their civil rights restored. After him was Rick Scott. And Rick Scott was in office 8 years. And in his 8 years, less than 5,000 people had their rights restored. And so this governor, he comes in and he changes the policy. He make everybody wait out of 5 or 7 years after they've completed their sentence before they're allowed to just apply. Then after they apply, there's still like a waiting process. I was at a clemency hearing in March of 2021, this year, and there was an attorney there that testified that he has a client who applied to have his rights restored in 2008. In 2008, this guy applied, and here we are in 2021, and he's still waiting to have a hearing. And so when Rick Scott created that policy, I was so like disappointed, and so many people were disappointed because the coalition spent a lot of years, used a lot of resources to at least get a policy where people with less serious offenses were able to get their rights restored automatic, and to see all of the work that was done over the years just be undone by a signature on a piece of paper was disheartening. And one of the things I thought about, because at the time, the Sentencing Project had reported that 1.54 million people in Florida couldn't vote because of a felony conviction. I thought, wow, could we rally all these people and get them to go to Tallahassee and tell the governor to give us our rights back? And I thought about that image, right? About 1 million people on the governor's lawn, And some of us walk up and knock on his door. Hey, governor, give us our rights back. And I could see the governor peeking out of the window and seeing a million returning citizens on his lawn and closing the window back and going about his business because none of those people could vote. And then I thought about, wow, this governor just won his race by 63,000 votes. What if I can get a returning citizen to get one family member, two family members to pledge to vote on their behalf? Would the governor listen then? And that's what I started out doing. I started with these pledge cards that I made off of what's the PowerPoint or whatever. Yeah, I made a rinky dink pledge card with basically having returning citizens get five family members to pledge to vote on their behalf. And what I believed was that blood was thicker than water. And I think that if you get a family member or someone who loves you, a particular family member though, to go into a voting booth with you on their mind, right? And that I think that more times than not, that voting for you could withstand the good sounding politicians or the negative ad bites or the commercials and everything. And so I was saying, let's organize not along party lines, not along racial lines. Let's organize along bloodlines. That's how it started, right? And I didn't, really recognize how powerful that could be and how powerful love is. Um, I was just looking at bloodlines, right? But as we progressed, then we decided to launch the ballot initiative. About a year or two later, that's when it started really sitting in that yes, let's talk to people about people who they love. We could talk about how felon disenfranchisement have its racist roots, and we could talk about how it was meant to disenfranchise newly freed slaves. We could talk about that, but is everybody going to be moved by that? Maybe not. But what is it that we can talk about that we know that everybody can be moved by? As someone who they love. So that was the focal point.
So you knocked on people's door and you would say,
Do you know anyone who you love who's ever made a mistake?
and how could you not vote for Amendment
I
4?
know,
How could
right?
your heart not be moved?
I only had two people. Traveled the entire state. Let me tell you, I've driven over 50,000 miles a year in my car. I've searched high and I've searched low. And I could only remember two encounters in which I walked away knowing that that person was not going to vote for Amendment 4. And the one of them was this guy at a tailgate party, the arena where the football stadium where the Jacksonville Jaguars play in Jacksonville. I remember when I was walking up to him, he made sure to let me know he was voting for Donald Trump. And I'm like, that's cool. And I asked him that famous question, and he said, yes, my son. And when he said that, I was like, I got him. I got him. And I said, don't you want your son to be able to vote after he served his time? And this guy said, hell no. My son is too damn stupid. I don't ever want him voting. And so when he said that, I was like, wow, if this guy don't even want his own son to vote, there's no need to even continue the conversation. So I thanked him for his time and I moved on. But that was one of two times that when I walked away, I knew, okay, that person is not going to vote for Amendment 4. But I've been in rooms with conservative folks that have given standing ovations after I finished speaking and have talked about how they're going to vote for Amendment 4 and talked about stories of their loved ones, whether it was a mother or a daughter or a granddaughter who had a meth problem, right? Or who had an opioid problem or who had a DUI manslaughter or whatever, or the kids who may have made a mistake at a young age and they have those stories, and those stories are real. I always have to tell people that when I was arrested, the police didn't ask me if I was Democrat or Republican. And when I appeared before a judge to get sentenced, he didn't ask me that either. And I know that getting caught up in the criminal justice system, it's not only for Democrats. I used to tell them because you will have some folks say, "Yeah, the Republicans, they don't want people with felony convictions to get the right to vote back because they know that they all vote Democrat, and they'll be out of a job." And I used to say, "Don't say that because what you basically saying is only Democrats get in trouble. Only Democrats break the law." And I know that that's not true. That's not true. People break the law. People get in trouble, and they come from all walks of life and all political persuasions.
And who among us doesn't know someone we adore and love more than life itself who's made a mistake? You have constitutionalized grace.
Yep.
What would you have people do? What is the action that we can do today? What is the most important thing?
That's a tough question. Let me start it with the easy one. Folks can go to our website at www.floridarrc.com, or they can go to our Facebook page. There's so many ways that folks can be helpful. We have a fines and fees campaign where we're raising money.
$27 million so far, correct?
Yep.
Is
Well,
that
no, over that. We're using it to pay people's fines and fees because nobody should be forced to choose between either putting food on their table or voting, right? Or paying their rent or mortgage or voting. And so we have a fines and fees fund that we're constantly raising money for to help people remove those financial barriers. We have our Big Red Free to Vote bus tour. We got this bus going around the state of Florida so folks can donate to help us continue to keep the bus on the road.
I just had this image of Free the Vote bus tour arriving, knocking on people's doors and telling them basically they've won the civil rights lottery.
But we have been doing that. Let me tell you, every stop we've made, we have encountered people who, I mean, it's been like a crying fest. We had one gentleman who, for over 30 years, he's been wanting to vote, and we were able to give him a certificate that would show that he had the right to vote 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we've had people who fines and fees that we've paid that have now they've been able to get their driver's license back and start their own business as well as vote. We've had folks who were so poor they couldn't even afford to pay a $250 fine. And when they discovered that we paid it for them, just broke down in tears, talked about what it meant to them, and they were able to register to vote. Every single stop, we have been touched. We've been so touched by the stories of people who have had their hopes restored, their dignity restored, because now they can be a part of our democracy. And so that's happening already. That bus is pulling up and we're knocking on doors. Oh, yes, we are. And as a matter of fact, this weekend, we're going to be in Dade County for 3 days, looking to help at least 16,000 people. We are going big. If they go big or stay at home, we're trying to help as many people as possible. Just get plugged right back into to the system. But let me tell you, in 2019, Time Magazine named me one of the 100 most influential people in the world, right? And I remember when I was notified of that, I was with my wife, and I was like, are they talking about the country? And my wife was like, no, baby, they're talking about the world. And my only response to that was that there was more than 100 countries in the world. Yet there I was, one of the 100 most influential people in the world in the world. And when we went to the gala, I remember telling the folks from Time Magazine that I was disappointed in them because they put The Rock on their cover, right? I was like, "You should have put me on the cover," right? I'm gonna tell you why. It wasn't because of ego, it wasn't because of any kind of conceit or whatever. But I felt that my story, August 2005, standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on the train to come so I can jump in front of it. I was homeless. I was addicted to drugs. I was unemployed. I was recently released from prison, and the only thing I owned were the clothes that was on my back. And I didn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and I waited on the train to come so I could end my life. And the train never came, and I crossed those tracks, and I checked myself into drug treatment. And after completing it, I moved into a homeless shelter. And while living in the homeless shelter, I decided to go to school, and I enrolled in one of the local community colleges, and I graduated at the top of my class, and I pursued another degree, and I graduated with highest honors. And eventually I applied to law school and got accepted. And 4 years later, I graduated with a law degree, became the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, dedicated my life to giving back to the community and fighting for our democracy. And eventually I led the effort to restore voting rights to 1.4 million people in Florida. I told them I should have been on that cover because people need to know that you don't have to be a movie star. You don't have to be an athlete. You don't have to be a politician. You don't have to be a billionaire to have an impact in your community, in your state, in this world. You don't. Because if that guy, Desmond, who was the crackhead, who was a homeless guy, if he was able to turn his life around and do the things that he did and led a successful Amendment 4 campaign in a state that is most difficult to win a citizens initiative in a political climate that said that that should have never passed. If that guy that was homeless and an addict can evolve and do those things and influence the world, then what that says is that anyone that hears my voice, anyone that sees my image could know that they too, they themselves have what it takes to be Time 100. They have what it takes to make a difference in their community, in their state. They have what it takes to make a difference in this country and the world. That key ingredient is love. It's love. In spite of the color of their skin, their sexual identity, their immigration status, their socioeconomic stature, whatever, in spite of their titles or degrees, all of that is irrelevant. Because when you cut through all of that, what we just see is another human being that God has created. I see my brother, my sister, and I love them. And I was willing to fight for them. And I was willing to sacrifice myself for them because I love them. That was the kind of love that Jesus had. And if we get that type of love, we can do amazing things, and this world will be a much better place. That's my advice.
Desmond, we love you back. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure just hanging out with you for a while.
So you heard it from Desmond. If he can do it, so can you. To learn more, check out the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition website, floridarrc.com. We are people in common. So glad you joined us. Thank you for listening.